Hi, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. And, folks, you will be educated today. I have with me, I'm so excited, I have with me today Dr. Greg Skomal. And I'll tell you what, I highly recommend that you Google Dr. Greg Skomal, Skomal, because the work he does, I can't even mention all of it because I want to interview him, but I will give a brief summary of Dr. Greg Skomal. He is an accomplished marine biologist, aquarist. He is a leading great shark expert. He's a scientist, underwater explorer, photographer, TedxSpeaker. Dr. Greg Skomal has been featured on Discovery Channel during Shark Week, National Geographic. He has written and published several articles and books. His new edition, The Shark Handbook, came out. He is going to be having a new book in July coming out, Chasing Shadows, about his life. He is also heads the Massachusetts Shark Research Program, has been a Senior Fisheries Biologist with Massachusetts Marine Fisheries since 1987. And I have learned so much just from listening to Dr. Greg Skomal and other shows and listening to his TEDx talk. And I highly recommend that you all do the same. And I want to introduce Dr. Greg Skomal to Chatting with Betsy. Welcome, Dr. Skomal.
Hi, Betsy. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You are welcome. I hope I covered correctly. You have such an intense biography. I'm fascinated with sharks. And I did read, like a while back, about the great whites coming up. And I live in New Jersey, coming up through New Jersey. Mary Lee, she was mentioned in the paper. And I'm fascinated. I'm like, I'm glad I don't go into the ocean anymore. But I would love for you to discuss what you do. I know that you're up in the Cape Cod area and the sea lions are there, so that brings in the sharks. And to discuss what work do you do and how is it helping us? So,
sure.
Wherever you'd like to start.
Yeah, no problem. I think it's important for your listeners to know, though, that historically the white shark is a species that is broadly distributed along the entire eastern seaboard of the U.S. So that's not new. We have a lot of historical records going back to the 1800s identifying white sharks here along our seaboard, all the way from the Gulf of Mexico along the coast of the U.S. up into Canadian waters. So that's not new. What has changed in the last couple of decades is we have restored certain populations of animals in the ocean successfully, which is a good thing. And one of those groups has been seals, and we've seen seal populations which were driven to the brink of extinction. We see them coming back as a result of protection that was put in place about 50 years ago. So it's taken a while, but seals are coming back. Now, if we look at seals, we know there's really just a couple of species that will actually eat seals, and one of those is the white shark. So with the restoration of seal populations, we're now seeing white sharks come back in greater numbers as well. And so what this has allowed me to do in my research program is to focus on white sharks for the first time, really, in this part of the world. You would think that we know a lot about white sharks, and we certainly do in other areas, but we know very little about white sharks in the Atlantic Ocean. And so now that I've got predictable access to white sharks, which come close to the shoreline in Cape Cod to feed on seals, we're now able to study this species pretty intensively. And I'm particularly interested in everything from natural history which includes answering questions like growth rates and feeding ecology and distribution, migration patterns. But also I'm interested in fine-scale behavior. How do these sharks behave close to shore? And I'm interested in that because there have been a series of shark attacks off the coast of Cape Cod in recent years as a result of white sharks being there. So we're trying to learn as much as we can about this species so that we can enhance public safety.
Yes, I remember reading about an attack. It might have been 2018. A swimmer was swimming who swam that area all the time and was attacked. And the I forgot the guy's name.
Right.
You might know who I'm talking about. And I just, it's kind of, to me, the great whites are scary, but yet they're, to me, like a mystery and majestic. As I said before we recorded, the way they just jump up, like in the air to catch the seal or whatever it is that they're going to eat, and as big as they are, to be able to do that, it's just fascinating to me.
Right.
That might sound a little weird, but I find that fascinating. And I have to say this, Dr. Skomal, I would not go out in the open ocean in a little kayak or paddleboard. I'd want a yacht to go out into the open waters. Because I don't know.
I think
they could flip.
Well, no, I wouldn't worry about that. It's important to put, you're obviously, Betsy, a little nervous when it comes to sharks, and you're concerned about shark attack. But I think it's really important to put, shark attack in perspective when we compare it to other things that can hurt us. And you've all heard the analogies, right? Lightning strikes and such. But the bottom line is, the probability of a shark attack is extremely low. And I always tell people, don't be afraid to go in the water because you think you're going to be attacked by a shark. There are areas where white sharks are feeding on seals in shallow water that I would caution people when they swim. But for most of the eastern seaboard of the U.S., the probability of such an event is so low that it's almost absurd not to consider swimming.
Well, thank you for putting that in perspective for me, Dr. Skomal. I love the story, and I'd like for you to share it of how you got interested in sharks, because I think it's phenomenal that you watched the movie Jaws and you became interested, where a lot of people were like, I'm not going in the water after watching that movie. So if you could share that, I think the audience would be really interested in that story.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Connecticut, a suburb of New York City, and as such, I didn't have access to area, the ocean all that much. Long Island Sound, which was not far from my house, wasn't, an area where I spent a lot of time, because in those days, we're talking back in the 1970s, it wasn't the cleanest body of water, and certainly not a place I would go to explore. So I grew up really falling in love with the ocean by watching it on TV or in films. And one of the first films I saw was the movie Jaws in a movie theater, and I was fascinated by it. I loved it. I thought it was an amazing film. I knew from my own experience reading about sharks that much of what I saw in the film was not true. But I was particularly fascinated by the marine scientist in the film who studied sharks. And he kind of inspired me to go down the road I did go down. And I really decided at an early age that it would be really cool to be a marine biologist, and specifically, if at all possible, I'd love to study sharks. So I'm one of those rare people that had a childhood dream and actually got to do it. And I think that's a real luxury.
Yes, that it's inspiring that you had a dream and you went for it. And were your parents encouraging you? What do they think of your dream?
Well, I was one of 7 kids, And,
Wow.
And what's really interesting, my father had a pretty successful insurance agency, but for all of his children, although they worked there at some point in their early lives, decided they wanted to go do something more creative. And he had no regrets because he and my mom were both incredibly supportive of all of us. So we've got people doing everything from writing to acting to studying sharks in my family, and I thank my parents for being so supportive.
I think that's wonderful. I have to ask this question, Dr. Greg, because I'm really curious about it. When someone is attacked by a great white, do you believe, because they don't, humans aren't on their diet, they don't like the taste of us, do you believe it's a case of mistaken identity or a territorial, like, I don't want your paddleboard in here or your boat? Or are they just curious?
It really is, by all accounts. Now, we can't get in the brains of these animals as much as we'd like to. Based on all the available evidence, it really does, in the case of the white shark at least, appear to be a case of mistaken identity. White sharks feed naturally on seals and sea lions, throughout the world. And people, when they're at the surface, whether they be swimming or surfing or even diving, we're dressed like seals. We sometimes act like seals, and white sharks make mistakes. Now, they don't do it very often, but when they do, it can be, devastating, obviously. So we really do believe it's a case of mistaken identity.
My dad was funny. My dad was in the Navy during World War II, and he said he used to swim with the sharks. They would put the nets down, and he said, well, Betsy, if they're hungry, they'll take a bite. And if they're still hungry, they'll munch a little more. My father had a sick sense of humor. But that mistaken identity, could take your arm or leg off. And I'm also curious, because I ask questions that I'm curious about, is there a difference with behavior between the East Coast sharks that come up the East Coast and the West Coast?
Yeah, it's absolutely, and I think that's a really great question, because it really points to the what I like to call the plasticity of the behavior of this species. So how flexible and adaptable they are to their environment. If we look at white sharks around the world and we look at the various habitats that they live in, you mentioned white sharks leaping out of the water. Well, that happens almost exclusively in South Africa, where they're feeding on seals that are right at the surface. And they hit those seals with such force that it carries their bodies out of the water. California is very different. California has different water characteristics, different habitat characteristics, different land characteristics, and white sharks have to adapt to that area. And then we've got white sharks around Cape Cod, and that's incredibly different. I mean, that's shallow water, it's sandy habitat, shifting sandbars, poor visibility, and the white sharks are successful in feeding on seals there. So it really talks about the capacity of this animal to adapt to the specific environment in which it's trying to feed.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating to me, and I did read where the great whites are coming in closer to shore. Do you, in your opinion, is that due to climate change, of water temperature, or where the seals are going, or sea lions?
We believe it's almost exclusively driven by the presence of their prey. So seals. Seals pile up very close to shore. They're on the beaches. They haul out. This is where they aggregate in big numbers. That's what seals do. So white sharks need to go into these shallow areas in order to feed.
That's incredible. So you would highly recommend folks do not dive or swim where there is the food that the great whites like to eat, sea lions and seals. And I have to ask, because I want people to know, how is the great white shark, why is the great white shark important to the balance of the ocean? Why is it important to us to keep white sharks alive and to keep them populating?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question, and and we're just really beginning to dive into this subject a lot more from a scientific perspective, and that is when you look at the marine ecosystem, the ocean in general, and then the various ecosystems within that ocean. You got tropical ecosystems, you got temperate ecosystems. All those ecosystems have various parts or components to it. We think of the food web. The role that white sharks play is at the very, very top of the food web. Sharks in general play that role. And as top predators, they really do help to keep the ocean in balance. Just as you need some of the lowest levels on the food web, which would be abundant fishes for sharks to feed on, you also need those top predators to keep the ocean in balance or in an equilibrium. So if you remove really any piece of the puzzle doesn't fit together anymore. It doesn't look right, and it doesn't operate correctly. So if we remove the sharks in too many numbers, the ecosystem comes out of equilibrium and is disrupted. And that's not good for us because we rely on the ocean in so many ways. And it's not good for sharks or for the species, believe it or not, upon which they feed. Every species has a role, and pulling too much of that animal out of the ocean disrupts it. And that's important for us to realize. That's why we need sharks in general. We need white sharks.
Well, thank you. I watched a clip of you out on the, I call it the pier, where you're tagging the great white, and the shark jumped up. How did you feel when you saw that shark come up? You were out, I call it the pier, but whatever you call that part of the ship that you were on, you were tagging.
Yeah, I was out on the stand, or sometimes referred to as a pulpit. And
pulpit, that's
basically, yeah, we walk out on the end of that pulpit, and that was quite an experience. It's really interesting because I was out there and I could not see the shark. I was looking for it. The visibility in the water was really poor. And normally what I do when I'm out there is the first thing I do when I see the shark is I try to videotape each side of it so we can identify who that shark is, because white sharks have very specific individual markings that allow us to tell who they are. And we can also determine whether it's a male or a female, estimate size, those kinds of things. So I was out there waiting to find this white shark when suddenly it erupted below me, below the pulpit, with its mouth wide open, seemingly wanting to snatch me. And but that whole event, really lasted a split second. And so it didn't really sink in. I looked down, and here's this wide open mouth, and then it disappeared. So I wondered whether I had actually imagined it. But everybody on the boat, screamed. And then I reviewed the video several times, several hundred times, and try to interpret what's going on there. But clearly that white shark made a lunge at me. And fortunately, I was too high off the water and protected by the pulpit. So, but it was rattling. It was definitely rattling.
How would you recommend for people to get involved with their area, or to know more about the great white? I know you are you associated with the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy?
Yeah, I work closely with the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. I always ask people if they want to know more about my work and our work here, visit the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, webpage, which is atlanticwhiteshark.org. But also, follow us on their social media pages. I work for the State Division of Marine Fisheries, and I will tell you, quite honestly, as a state agency, we don't do a very good job of keeping the public up to date on our activities. So I encourage folks to go to the Conservancy's page because I work closely with them, and they do a great job of telling you what's going on with white sharks, the research we're doing, some of our findings, and we're really all about trying to get the information we're learning out to the public.
I might have forgotten to mention that you also had the Massachusetts Shark Research Program. Do they have a Facebook page, Dr. Greg?
Well, yeah, that's the program I run for the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. So I work for the State Resource Agency here in Massachusetts, and that's the specific program that I started way back in the late 80s. And, we do not, my agency does have a YouTube channel. We have Facebook pages, but we're not up to date on everything that's going on because it's a relatively big agency, and sometimes white sharks gets buried with the whales and the squid and the codfish and the striped bass and the other species. So unfortunately, I don't do social media myself. I just don't have the time, and frankly, I don't necessarily have the interest.
I understand that. I went on these Facebook pages. I think it's phenomenal. Really, the work that you and your team do is really fascinating, and I thank you for doing that work. It takes a brave soul to me to dive into that water and to just be with the sharks. What do you think of these people? I'd like to have your personal opinion that they feed the sharks, they pet the sharks. Do you think that's putting the public in danger or sending a wrong message? I'm not talking about a professional like you. I'm talking about someone who's just wants, their 15 minutes of fame, and they go doing these crazy stints.
Yeah, I don't necessarily support that. I do promote folks who want to dive with sharks, diving when there's a lot of opportunities throughout the world for many different kinds of species, including white sharks. So I support that. I think that's educational. I think when you do go in the water with sharks, you just keep your hands to yourself. Try not to touch them. And remember, as incredible and remarkable, fantastic these animals are, they are an animal, and they are unpredictable in many ways. So, even trained scientists like me and others that I've worked with, I've seen my colleagues get bit because when we're handling sharks, it can be extremely dangerous. So, yeah, I don't promote the activity of handling or touching sharks in their natural environment. Leave them alone, enjoy them, photograph them, watch them, and admire them from afar.
Yes, I agree. Me personally, I would want to be in one of those cages, not out loose in the ocean. I definitely would want to be in a cage. My father, when I went to Bahamas back in 1979, he said, "Betsy, watch out for sharks. There's sharks in the Bahamas." And I can't see without my glasses. And I was always afraid of that, even in New Jersey, because they could be yelling shark, and I won't see or hear them until that shark would be right up in front of my face. But thankfully, that never happened. What can you recommend, Dr. Greg, to avoid being a victim of a shark attack? What should people do?
Well, I think, what I tell folks to do is, if you're going to go in the ocean, have a kind of the first thing you need to have is a really good understanding of your own abilities in the water. People forget that we are actually land animals. And as land animals, we didn't evolve, in the ocean, and we're not very good. We're extremely awkward in the ocean. And by far more people die from drowning and rip currents and accidents in or around the ocean than they do from sharks. So know your own strengths and weaknesses. Know the area where you are swimming. Are there any hazards there? Are there riptides, for example? Are there any underwater obstructions that can hurt you? How deep is it? And then if you're concerned about the presence of dangerous animals, you know, take a little time and do a little research on that area. You know, like I said, the likelihood of a shark attack anywhere along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. is extremely low until you get to certain areas like Cape Cod, where you've got white sharks, particularly along the eastward-facing beaches, feeding on seals in shallow water. That's where you have to be concerned. But if you're swimming off, you know, beaches from, you know, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, you know, the risk is extremely low.
Thank you. And I also heard, like, not to wear shiny jewelry, and not to swim at dusk or dawn, and
Yes.
away from jetties.
Well, it depends. If there's people fishing off of jetties using bait, you know, they could be drawing sharks to them. Piers, fishing piers, you know, look for signs of bait in the water. If there's birds, you know, splashing and flying right off the surface of the water and there's fish crashing, sharks are drawn to that kind of activity. You know, you mentioned dawn and dusk. Some sharks feed at dawn and dusk, and therefore swimming at dawn and dusk can be a little bit more dangerous. Shiny jewelry, people mention shiny jewelry, and that's because some species of sharks feed on schooling fish, which tend to be silver and shiny. And so if there's sharks feeding close to shore, you know, that flash could stimulate them. So you got to be careful and cognizant of your surroundings.
Yes, I agree. And I've said this when I interviewed someone else about sharks. You know, we're going into their home. We're a guest when we go into the ocean. That's how I feel. And we need to respect their home and to respect the animals that live in the ocean and to take the precautions of, you know, to me, Dr. Greg, it's just common sense. You know, you're right. If you know your swimming abilities, if you're not a great swimmer, don't go in deep. I mean, here in New Jersey, they're constantly telling people when there's a riptide, do not go in the water. There are signs on the beach. And yet these people think, you know, they're above the law or they could swim, and then they drown. And then they cause other people to drown when they're trying to save them. Really respect the ocean is how I feel. My dad, he used to tell me, Betsy, if you're caught in a riptide, don't panic, swim parallel to the shore. I know it's easier said than done when you're caught in that, and thankfully I was never caught in one, but I think people just tend to panic. Dr. Skomal, tell us about your book that you had, the Great White Shark Handbook, which is available on Amazon.
Right. So several years ago, I wrote the Shark Handbook, which is a general volume that talks about sharks in general, what we know about them, and how we as scientists study them to learn various aspects of shark biology. I've just published our third edition to that. And then I've got another book coming out that is almost exclusively about white sharks called the White Shark Handbook, the Great White Shark Handbook. And that one is in the same format. It's everything you ever wanted to know about white sharks, and from their biology, their distribution, natural history, to ecotourism, shark cage diving, shark attack, and threats to sharks, conservation. And so that's coming out this summer. And then I've got another book coming out this summer called Chasing Shadows, which is almost more of a personal memoir that documents how I came about being who I am and doing the work that I'm doing, and the complexities, the politics, and those aspects of being a shark researcher.
Wow, you are one busy guy. Writing books, going out in the field, doing, Discovery Channel, and being featured on Shark Week. You are just amazing, and I so enjoy talking to you. And, folks, I just want to tell you that Dr. Skomal's book has 5-star reviews, and I would definitely look into it. And you also have a lot of different books about how to do aquariums.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the aspects of my childhood which I loved was if I couldn't go out and see fish in my neighborhood, I brought them into my home. So I became really enthralled by keeping aquariums, and so many of my early books were about aquarium keeping.
Yeah, that's good. I have a funny story, but I want to encourage parents. If your child is interested in the ocean, see if there's a camp, like a day camp in the summer that is down in the ocean area many years ago. I think I was 9 or 10. I went to Sandy Hook. It was a day camp to learn about the ocean and to catch crabs. And I must be a little gruesome. I took this crab in a jar with formaldehyde, and it had like little fish in it. But I had such a crush on one of the teachers about learning about fish. But it was a great program. I don't know if they still have that. Do they have anything like that in your area?
Yeah, there's a number of different groups that will have camps. I mean, the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy has a summer camp. So, yeah, I absolutely recommend parents, if your kids are interested in the ocean, by all means, get them involved, get some hands-on experience, dealing with, interacting with the ocean, and don't be afraid. It's a lot of fun.
Yes. Yeah, I just thought about that. I mean, that's going back many, many years ago. I was always boy crazy. But it was interesting, and I really enjoyed it because you got to see the different kind of, horseshoe crabs, and I don't think they went into sharks because that was in the 60s. I think it was about 67 or 68 that I went. So they didn't, sharks wasn't really huge back then. But I'm so glad, really, for people like you, Dr. Greg Skomal, who are researching sharks and teaching us about sharks and how important they are to the environment. And people can get involved by going on these different websites. And I want to thank you for writing all your books, doing all that you do, and being a phenomenal guest on my show today. And you are welcome to come back to talk about your book, Chasing Shadows, whenever you have time. You're one busy guy.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Betsy. Thank you. It's a treat to be able to get the information that we're generating out there, and so I appreciate what you do, and thank you for inviting me on your show.
You're welcome. It is my pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Greg Skomal. Folks, the information about Dr. Greg Skomal will be in the blog, so please read the blog. Jeannie White, who's station manager, writes and produces the show. Thank you, Jeannie. I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, who's CEO of Passion Talk Radio, makes this all possible. And I want to thank you, the listeners, for listening. Please share this show. Shark shows do very well. And I know I'm fascinated with sharks, and I think other people are too. And when you share my show, it helps me carry on in my husband's memory. And people need to know about the environment. We need to get involved. And I also do the show to help other people live better lives by providing resources for those. We think we're all alone in how we feel, but we're not, because there's other people who feel the same way. And I also want to invite you all to follow me on my own Facebook page, Betsy E. Wurzel, W-R-Z-E-L. You could get a glimpse into my personal life and see pictures of Matt and Josh and what I stand for. And I also like to encourage everyone, if you're looking for a support group, if you're a caregiver, know a caregiver, eventually we might all be caregivers, I have #Kick Alzheimer's Ass Movement book on Facebook, and you are all welcome to join. And thank you for listening. It is free to subscribe to Chatting with Betsy. I'm on Spotify, Spreaker, iHeart, just to name a few, and I would really appreciate it if you would tell your friends about my show. because I have phenomenal guests on, and I do have a phenomenal lineup in 2023, if I have to say so myself. So sometimes I have to toot my own horn. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you can be anything, please be kind, shine your light bright. And I think if we all did that, it would be a much kinder, brighter world. And that's what I have to say today, folks. I am so excited to talk to Dr. Greg Skomal. Look him up. Google Dr. Greg Skomal, Skomal. You see all the work that he's doing, that he's done. Go on the Amazon.com. You could see all his books. And I just think Dr. Greg Skomal is a phenomenal person. And that's my opinion. And I'm sticking to it. So that's what I have to say today, folks. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate Rural Talk Radio. We'll chat again soon. Bye-bye now.